The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Major Sarah Mitchell performed her pre-flight inspection of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Her calloused hands moved methodically over the aircraft's titanium skin, checking each panel and rivet with the practiced precision of someone who had done this routine over 200 times in combat zones. The Warthog, as pilots affectionately called the ungainly aircraft, wasn't much to look at compared to the sleek F-16s and F-18s parked nearby. Its twin engines hung awkwardly beneath stubby wings, and its nose was dominated by a massive GU A-10 Avenger cannon that could spit out depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. Sarah had been flying the A-10 for 8 years, ever since graduating from the Air Force Academy with a degree in aerospace engineering. At 32, she was one of only 14 female A-10 pilots in the entire Air Force, a statistic that followed her everywhere she went. But Sarah had long since stopped caring about being the only woman in the briefing room. What mattered was her ability to provide close air support to troops on the ground, and her record spoke for itself. 0 friendly fire incidents, 47 confirmed enemy kills, and a reputation for getting in closer to the action than anyone thought possible. The mission briefing that morning had been routine, at least by Afghanistan standards. Intelligence indicated Taliban fighters had been moving supplies through a valley system approximately 60 miles northeast of Bagram. A team of Navy SEALs would insert via helicopter to conduct reconnaissance and disrupt the supply line. Sarah's job was to provide overwatch and close air support if needed. The SEALs had specifically requested high-altitude support, operating from at least 10,000 feet to avoid small arms fire and maintain the element of surprise. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Razor" Morrison led the 8-man SEAL team. At 38, Morrison was a 15-year veteran of special operations with deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified missions in Africa and Southeast Asia. He had worked with dozens of pilots over the years, and in his experience, the best air support came from aircraft that stayed high and used precision-guided munitions to eliminate targets from a safe distance. Morrison had seen too many close air support missions go wrong when pilots got cocky and flew too low, compromising both the ground team's position and their own aircraft. During the joint briefing, Morrison had been clear about his expectations. "Major Mitchell, we appreciate your support on this operation," he said, his weathered face serious as he pointed to the mission map. "We'll be moving through these valleys here and here. If we need air support, we'd prefer you maintain altitude above 10,000 feet and use your targeting pod for precision strikes. We don't want to announce our presence with low-flying aircraft." Sarah nodded politely, but something in her expression caught Morrison's attention. It wasn't disagreement exactly, more like quiet confidence that suggested she might have different ideas about how close air support should work. Morrison had seen that look before in young pilots who thought they knew better than special operations veterans. It usually led to problems. "Understood, Commander," Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. "I'll maintain altitude as requested. But if the situation changes and you need immediate support, I want you to know that the A-10 is capable of operating effectively at much lower altitudes. Sometimes getting closer to the fight is the difference between mission success and failure." Morrison exchanged glances with his team sergeant, Master Chief Petty Officer David Bull Rodriguez. Rodriguez, a stocky man with 22 years in the Navy and arms like tree trunks, shook his head slightly. Both men had seen pilots make that argument before, usually right before they created more problems than they solved. "Major, with respect, we've been doing this for a while," Morrison said, his tone firm but not dismissive. "High-altitude support has worked well for us in the past. Let's stick with what we know works." The conversation ended there, but Sarah could sense the underlying tension. The SEAL saw her as a support asset to be managed, not a partner in the operation. It was a common attitude among ground forces, especially special operations teams that prided themselves on self-sufficiency. They wanted air support available if things went wrong, but they didn't want pilots making tactical decisions that might affect their mission. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her aircraft and began the methodical process of preparation. She loaded the targeting coordinates into her navigation system, checked her weapons load, and reviewed the weather data for the target area. The A-10 carried a mixed payload that day. 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, a full load of 30mm ammunition for the Gu-8 cannon, and an assortment of general-purpose bombs. It was a standard loadout for close air support missions, designed to engage everything from individual fighters to armored vehicles. As she strapped into the cockpit, Sarah thought about the conversation with the SEAL team. She understood their preference for high-altitude support from a tactical perspective. Flying low meant exposing the aircraft to ground fire, and it could potentially give away the position of friendly forces. But Sarah had learned from experience that sometimes the textbook approach wasn't the most effective one. The A-10 had been designed specifically for close air support, with heavy armor protection and the ability to absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft. More importantly, getting close to the target meant better target identification and more precise fires, factors that could be critical when friendly forces were in close contact with the enemy. The flight to the target area took 45 minutes, with Sarah maintaining radio contact with the SEAL team as they moved through the valley system. The terrain below was typical Afghanistan, rocky, bare mountains broken by narrow valleys and dry riverbeds. From 15,000 feet, Sarah could see the entire area of operation spread out like a three-dimensional map. Her targeting pod provided crystal-clear imagery of the valleys where the SEALs were operating, but at that altitude, individual human figures were barely visible even with maximum magnification. For the first 2 hours of the mission, everything went according to plan. The SEAL team moved methodically through their assigned sectors, gathering intelligence and documenting Taliban activity. Sarah orbited overhead, monitoring their progress and scanning for potential threats. The Taliban supply route appeared to be inactive that morning, with no visible movement in the target areas. Then, everything changed in the span of 30 seconds. "Phoenix, this is Razor." Morrison's voice came over the radio, urgent but controlled. "We have eyes on approximately 15 to 20 Taliban fighters moving through Grid 41 SMD 12345 67890. They appear to be armed with small arms and at least 2 RPGs. They haven't spotted us yet, but they're moving toward our position." Sarah immediately slewed her targeting pod toward the coordinates Morrison had provided. Through the high-resolution camera, she could see a group of fighters moving through a narrow valley approximately 800 meters from the SEAL team's position. They were spread out in a tactical formation and moving with purpose. This wasn't a random patrol. "Razor, I have eyes on the target," Sarah replied. 15 fighters visible, armed with AK-47s and RPGs as you reported. They're moving along the valley floor toward your position. Do you want me to engage? Negative, Phoenix. They haven't seen us yet. We're going to try to stay hidden and let them pass. Maintain overwatch and be ready to engage if they discover our position. For 15 tense minutes, Sarah watched through her targeting pod as the Taliban fighters moved through the valley. The SEALs had taken cover behind a rocky outcropping, invisible from the air and hopefully from ground level as well. Sarah kept her aircraft in a wide orbit at 12,000 feet, high enough to avoid detection, but close enough to provide immediate support if needed. The plan was working until one of the Taliban fighters decided to take a bathroom break. Sarah watched in real time as the fighters separated from the main group and walked directly toward the rocky outcropping where the SEALs were hidden. Through her targeting pod, she could see the man climbing over the rocks, AK-47 slung across his back, completely unaware that 8 heavily armed American Special Operations soldiers were crouched just 20 feet away. "Razor, you have one fighter moving directly toward your position," Sarah warned over the radio. "He's going to be on top of you in about 30 seconds. Copy, Phoenix. We see him." What happened next unfolded like a deadly game of chess played at lightning speed. The Taliban fighter rounded a large boulder and found himself face to face with Master Chief Rodriguez. For a split second, both men froze, processing the unexpected encounter. Then, training took over. Rodriguez lunged forward, grabbing the fighter's weapon and clamping a hand over his mouth to prevent him from shouting a warning. The two men wrestled silently for several seconds before Rodriguez was able to neutralize the threat. But the damage was done. The fighter had been away from the main group for too long, and his companions were already calling for him. Phoenix, we're compromised. Morrison's voice was tight with controlled urgency. The main group knows something's wrong. We need immediate support. Sarah could see the situation developing through her targeting pod. The Taliban fighters were spreading out, searching for their missing comrade. In less than a minute, they would discover the SEAL team's position. From 12,000 feet, Sarah had a clear shot with her Maverick missiles, but the rocky terrain and the proximity of friendly forces made a precision strike extremely challenging. Razor, I can engage with Mavericks from current altitude, but I need you to mark your position and give me exact distance to nearest enemy fighters. Phoenix, friendlies are marked with IR strobe. Nearest enemy is approximately 150 meters to our northeast. We need immediate suppression so we can move to alternate position. Sarah studied the tactical display, calculating angles and blast radii. A Maverick missile would certainly eliminate the Taliban fighters, but 150 meters was uncomfortably close for friendly forces, especially in rocky terrain where shrapnel could bounce unpredictably. She could see the SEAL's IR strobe through her targeting pod, a tiny pinprick of light invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible through her night vision systems. The textbook solution was to fire the missile and hope the blast pattern didn't injure friendly forces. It was an acceptable risk according to military doctrine, and it was exactly what Morrison expected her to do. But Sarah had a different idea, one that would either save the day or get her court-martialed. Razor, I'm coming in low for gun runs. I can put 30 millimeters fire exactly where you need it without risking friendly casualties from missile blast. There was a long pause on the radio. Through her targeting pod, Sarah could see the Taliban fighters getting closer to the SEAL position. Time was running out. Negative, Phoenix. Morrison finally replied, his voice strained. Maintain altitude and use precision-guided munitions. We don't need you taking unnecessary risks. But Sarah was already pushing her aircraft into a steep dive, trading altitude for speed and maneuverability. The A-10's twin engines roared as she descended through 8,000 feet, then 6,000, then 4,000. The rocky terrain rushed up to meet her as she leveled off at 500 feet above ground level, her aircraft screaming across the valley at 350 knots. Phoenix, what are you doing? Morrison's voice carried a mix of alarm and anger. Pull up and maintain altitude. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was too busy lining up her gun run, using every bit of skill and experience she had acquired over 8 years of flying the A-10. At 500 feet, she could see everything with perfect clarity. The Taliban fighters moving through the rocks, the SEAL's position behind their cover, the exact terrain features that would shape the battle in the next few minutes. The Gu-8 cannon was designed for tank killing, but Sarah knew it could be equally effective against personnel targets when used with precision. Each 30mm round carried enough explosive power to eliminate a human target, but the key was placing the rounds exactly where they needed to go without endangering friendly forces. Sarah lined up her first pass, targeting a group of 3 Taliban fighters who had separated from the main force and were moving toward the SEALs from the east. At 1,500 feet from the target, she squeezed the trigger and sent a 3-second burst of 30mm fire into the rocks where the fighters were positioned. The distinctive sound of the Ju-8, like a giant zipper being opened, echoed across the valley as depleted uranium rounds pulverized rock and flesh with equal efficiency. The effect was immediate and devastating. The 3 Taliban fighters simply disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. But more importantly, the psychological impact on the remaining fighters was enormous. The sound of the A-10's cannon at close range was unlike anything most insurgents had ever experienced. It was the sound of death arriving from the sky with surgical precision. Sarah pulled up and banked hard to the left, setting up for another gun run. Through her targeting pod, she could see the remaining Taliban fighters scattering in panic, their tactical formation dissolving as they sought cover from the aircraft that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. Phoenix, that was danger close. Morrison shouted over the radio. You nearly hit our position. Negative. Razor, Sarah replied calmly as she lined up her second pass. Rounds impacted 200 meters from your position. I have clear visual on all friendly and enemy positions. This time, Sarah targeted a group of fighters who had taken cover behind a low stone wall. The 30mm rounds punched through the ancient stonework like it was made of paper, eliminating 4 more Taliban fighters and destroying their RPG launcher. The remaining insurgents began a hasty retreat, abandoning their weapons and fleeing toward the valley entrance. But Sarah wasn't finished. She could see that several fighters were trying to establish a new defensive position further up the valley, where they could potentially ambush the SEALs if the Americans tried to move to a new location. Sarah rolled into her third gun run, this time approaching from the opposite direction to catch the fighters before they could organize their defense. The third pass was the most challenging. The Taliban fighters had learned from the first 2 attacks and were using better cover, hiding among large boulders where they were difficult to distinguish from the surrounding terrain. Sarah had to fly even lower, dropping to 300 feet above ground level to get the angle she needed for an effective shot. At that altitude, Sarah could hear small arms fire pinging off her aircraft's armored hull. The A-10 had been designed to absorb this kind of punishment. The cockpit was surrounded by a titanium bathtub that could stop armor-piercing rounds, and the aircraft could continue flying even with significant damage to its engines and control surfaces. But knowing the aircraft could take the hits and actually experiencing them were 2 different things. Sarah ignored the ground fire and concentrated on her target. Through her head-up display, she could see the muzzle flashes from the Taliban fighters' weapons. She lined up the Gu-8 and fired a precise 2-second burst that eliminated the remaining organized resistance. The surviving Taliban fighters, maybe 5 or 6 out of the original 20, fled in complete disorder, leaving their weapons and equipment behind. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Sarah pulled her aircraft up to a safe altitude and began a wide orbit over the battle area, scanning for any remaining threats. The valley floor was littered with destroyed equipment and the evidence of her gun runs, but there was no sign of further Taliban activity. "Razor, this is Phoenix," Sarah called over the radio. "Area is secure. All enemy fighters have been eliminated or have fled the area. What's your status?" There was a long pause before Morrison replied. When he did, his voice carried a note of grudging respect that hadn't been there before. "Phoenix, Razor. We're all in one piece. That was some impressive flying, Major. We've never seen close air support like that. But the real test was just beginning. Word of the engagement would quickly reach higher headquarters, where senior officers would have to decide whether Sarah's low-altitude tactics represented dangerous cowboy behavior or innovative tactical thinking. The SEALs would submit their after-action report, and Sarah would have to justify her decision to ignore the altitude restrictions that had been in place for decades. As she flew back toward Bagram, Sarah reflected on what had just happened. She had proven that the A-10 could provide more effective close air support at low altitude, but she had also violated direct orders from the ground commander. In the military, results mattered, but so did following orders and maintaining discipline. The next few days would determine whether her actions would be seen as heroic or insubordinate. The radio crackled with another transmission from Morrison. "Phoenix, when we get back to base, I'd like to talk with you about your tactics. I think we might have been wrong about altitude restrictions." Sarah smiled inside her helmet. It was a small admission, but it suggested that maybe, just maybe, she had started to change some minds about how close air support should really work. The debriefing room at Bagram Airfield buzzed with tension as senior officers filed in for the post-mission analysis. Colonel Marcus Webb, the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing Commander, sat at the head of the polished conference table, his weathered face giving nothing away. To his right sat Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the A-10 Squadron Commander, and, across from her, Navy Captain James Thunder Thompson, the Special Operations Task Force Commander. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces as they waited for the principals to arrive. Sarah entered first, still wearing her flight suit, the smell of jet fuel and cordite clinging to her uniform. She had spent the past 3 hours completing post-flight inspections and writing her initial after-action report, carefully documenting every decision and action during the engagement. Her aircraft showed 17 small-caliber bullet strikes on the fuselage and wings, evidence of just how close she had gotten to the enemy positions. Lieutenant Commander Morrison followed a few minutes later, accompanied by Master Chief Rodriguez and 2 other members of his team. The SEALs looked tired, but alert, their desert camouflage uniforms still dusty from their time in the field. Morrison carried a thick folder containing his team's preliminary report and digital photos of the engagement area. Colonel Webb called the meeting to order with his characteristic directness. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to discuss this morning's engagement in Grid Square 41 SMD. Major Mitchell, Commander Morrison, I've read your initial reports, but I want to hear the details firsthand. Major, you violated established altitude minimums for close air support. Commander, your team's actions resulted in mission success with 0 friendly casualties. I need to understand exactly what happened out there. Sarah stood and moved to the large tactical display at the front of the room. Using a laser pointer, she began walking through the engagement step by step, her voice steady and professional despite the weight of scrutiny from the senior officers. Sir, at 0947 hours, Razor Team made contact with an estimated 20 Taliban fighters moving through the valley system. The enemy force was armed with small arms and RPGs and posed an immediate threat to the ground team. Initial engagement occurred when a Taliban fighter discovered the team's hide position. She clicked to the next slide, showing aerial photographs of the engagement area taken by her targeting pod. Commander Morrison requested immediate close air support to suppress enemy positions and allow team movement to an alternate location. From my initial altitude of 12,000 feet, I had clear visual on enemy positions, but faced several tactical challenges. Morrison leaned forward in his chair. He had been thinking about the engagement during the helicopter ride back to base, analyzing every decision and outcome. What he had seen that morning challenged fundamental assumptions he had held about close air support for his entire career. The enemy positions were dispersed among rocky terrain with significant elevation changes, Sarah continued. Maverick missiles would have been effective against the main group, but the blast radius posed an unacceptable risk to friendly forces at 150 meters separation. Additionally, several enemy fighters had taken positions that were masked from high-angle attack. Colonel Webb interrupted with a sharp question. Major, why didn't you request permission before descending to low altitude? Standard operating procedures require coordination with the ground commander for any altitude changes. Sarah met his gaze directly. Sir, the tactical situation was developing rapidly. Commander Morrison's team was in immediate danger, and I assessed that low-altitude gun runs would provide more precise fires with less risk to friendly forces. I made the decision based on my evaluation of the tactical situation and the capabilities of my aircraft. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. What Sarah was describing, a pilot making unilateral tactical decisions that contradicted established procedures, was exactly the kind of behavior that military doctrine was designed to prevent. Chain of command and standardized procedures existed for good reasons, and pilots who ignored them typically faced serious consequences. Captain Thompson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 28 years in special operations. Major Mitchell, help me understand your tactical reasoning. You were ordered to maintain altitude and use precision-guided munitions. What made you think you knew better than the ground commander? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the career implications of her next words, but she had committed to this course of action the moment she pushed her aircraft into that first dive. Sir, I wasn't second-guessing the ground commander's tactical assessment. Commander Morrison is one of the most experienced special operations officers I've worked with, but I have specific expertise in A-10 capabilities and close air support tactics that allow me to see options that might not have been apparent from the ground perspective. She clicked to the next slide, showing gun camera footage from her first pass. The black and white imagery showed her 30mm rounds impacting precisely on target, eliminating 3 Taliban fighters while leaving nearby rocks and terrain features intact. The GU, A-10 cannon provides surgical precision that's impossible to achieve with missiles or bombs. Each 30mm round impacts exactly where it's aimed with minimal collateral effects. From low altitude, I could distinguish individual enemy fighters from civilians or friendly forces with absolute certainty. Morrison stood up and moved to the display. "Sir, if I may interrupt, Major Mitchell is being modest about what happened out there. When she made that first gun run, I thought she was going to kill us all. I've never seen an aircraft fly that low in combat. But when those 30mm rounds started hitting exactly where she said they would, I realized we were seeing something new." He pointed to the aerial photo showing the first impact site. "Look at this damage pattern. She eliminated 3 enemy fighters who were in covered positions that we couldn't have engaged with our own weapons. The rounds impacted 200 meters from our position, close enough that we felt the concussion, but far enough away that we weren't in any danger from shrapnel." Master Chief Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Sir, I've been in special operations for 22 years. I've worked with every type of close air support you can imagine. F-16s, F-18s, Apache helicopters, AC-130 gunships. I've never seen anything like what Major Mitchell did yesterday. She didn't just provide fire support. She provided precision fire support." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. "Major Mitchell, walk me through your risk assessment. The A-10 is tough, but it's not invulnerable to ground fire. You took 17 hits during the engagement. How do you justify exposing a multi-million-dollar aircraft to that level of risk?" Sarah had been expecting this question. Aircraft preservation was a constant concern for squadron commanders, and the A-10 community had developed its tactics partly to minimize aircraft losses. Flying low over defended positions was the kind of behavior that got pilots killed and aircraft destroyed. "Ma'am, the A-10 was specifically designed for this mission. The titanium armor around the cockpit can stop 23mm cannon rounds. The redundant flight control systems mean the aircraft can continue flying even with significant battle damage. Most importantly, the lives of 8 special operations soldiers were at immediate risk. In my judgment, the tactical value of precise, close air support outweighed the risk to the aircraft." She pulled up another slide showing the aircraft's battle damage. "The 17 hits we took were all small caliber rounds that had no effect on aircraft systems or flight safety. This is exactly the kind of punishment the A-10 was built to absorb." Colonel Webb leaned back in his chair, processing the information. As a wing commander, he had to balance multiple competing priorities: mission effectiveness, force protection, adherence to established procedures, and the broader implications for how his units operated. What Sarah had done was tactically effective, but it also represented a significant departure from standard operating procedures. "Commander Morrison," Webb said, "I want your honest assessment. Did Major Mitchell's actions improve the tactical situation, or would conventional high-altitude support have been equally effective?" Morrison exchanged glances with Rodriguez before answering. "Sir, with all respect to established procedures, conventional support would not have been as effective. The enemy positions were too well concealed and too close to our location for safe use of missiles or bombs. Major Mitchell's gun runs eliminated the threat with surgical precision while allowing us to maintain our position and continue the mission." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, I've been skeptical of low-altitude, close air support my entire career. I've seen too many pilots take unnecessary risks that compromised mission security. But what Major Mitchell demonstrated was controlled, precise tactical flying that maximized the A-10's capabilities while minimizing risk to friendly forces." Captain Thompson nodded slowly. "The results speak for themselves. 20 enemy fighters neutralized with 0 friendly casualties and minimal collateral damage. But I'm concerned about the precedent this sets. If we start allowing pilots to ignore altitude restrictions, where does it end?" Sarah sensed an opportunity to address the broader tactical implications. "Sir, I'm not advocating for ignoring established procedures. But I think this engagement demonstrates that we might need to reconsider some of our assumptions about A-10 tactics. The aircraft was designed for low-altitude operations, and our current altitude restrictions may be preventing us from using its full capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked skeptical. Major, those altitude restrictions exist for good reasons. We've maintained them because they've kept our aircraft and crews safe while still providing effective support to ground forces. Yes, ma'am, but effective support and optimal support aren't necessarily the same thing, Sarah replied. What if we developed new tactical procedures that allowed for low-altitude operations under specific circumstances? We could maintain the safety and coordination that existing procedures provide while giving pilots the flexibility to use low-altitude tactics when a situation requires it. The room fell silent as the officers considered the implications. What Sarah was proposing, a fundamental revision of A-10 tactics, would require extensive testing, training, and coordination with ground forces. It would also require convincing senior leadership that changing decades of established doctrine was worth the potential risks. Morrison spoke up again. Sir, if I may make a suggestion, what if we conducted some joint training exercises to explore these tactics under control conditions? My team would be willing to work with Major Mitchell to develop procedures that maximize the effectiveness of low-altitude, close air support while maintaining appropriate safety margins. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. We could set up realistic training scenarios that test different engagement parameters, altitude, approach angles, coordination procedures. If Major Mitchell's tactics prove effective under training conditions, we could develop formal procedures for their implementation. Colonel Webb stood up and walked to the tactical display, studying the engagement imagery. He had flown F-16s earlier in his career and understood the institutional resistance to tactical innovation. The military's emphasis on standardized procedures served important purposes, but it could also prevent adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. Major Mitchell, I want you to prepare a detailed tactical analysis of yesterday's engagement. Include your recommendations for modified A-10 employment procedures and training requirements. Commander Morrison, I want your team to provide input on ground force coordination requirements and safety considerations. He turned back to face the group. I'm not ready to approve widespread changes to our operating procedures based on one engagement, no matter how successful it was. But I am interested in exploring whether there are better ways to employ the A-10's capabilities in support of special operations. Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. Webb was giving her the opportunity to prove that her tactics could work on a broader scale, but he was also setting up a situation where failure would end any chance of changing established doctrine. Sir, I'd like to request permission to coordinate with the Air Force Weapons School to develop a formal tactical testing program. If we're going to modify A-10 employment procedures, we need to do it with the same rigor we apply to any major tactical development. Webb nodded approvingly. Granted, I want a preliminary report in 2 weeks and a full tactical assessment within 30 days. If your analysis supports continued development of these tactics, we'll forward the recommendation to higher headquarters for review. As the meeting broke up, Morrison approached Sarah near the door. Major, I owe you an apology. I've been flying close air support missions for 15 years, and I thought I understood what aircraft could and couldn't do in support of ground operations. Yesterday, you showed me that I still have things to learn. Sarah smiled. Commander, you've been keeping special operations teams alive in combat while I've been flying training missions in Nevada. We both bring expertise to this problem. The key is figuring out how to combine that expertise to make our tactics more effective. Rodriguez joined the conversation, his weathered face serious. Major, what you did yesterday was impressive, but I want you to understand something. My boys and I put our lives in your hands when you made those gun runs. The fact that it worked out doesn't change the fact that you were making split-second decisions that could have killed us all. Sarah nodded, recognizing the gravity of his concern. Master Chief, you're absolutely right. That's why we need to develop formal procedures and training standards. What I did yesterday worked, but it was based on my individual assessment of the situation. If we're going to make this a standard tactic, we need to ensure that every pilot who uses it has the training and experience to do it safely. As the SEALs left the briefing room, Sarah remained behind with her squadron commander. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes waited until they were alone before speaking. Sarah, I want you to understand the position you've put me in. What you did yesterday was tactically brilliant but it was also a clear violation of established procedures. If this goes badly, it's not just your career on the line. It's mine too. Sarah met her commander's gaze directly. Ma'am, I understand the risks, but I also believe that we have an obligation to explore ways to make our tactics more effective. The A-10 is an incredible aircraft with capabilities that we're not fully utilizing. If we can develop procedures that allow us to employ those capabilities safely and effectively, we owe it to the ground forces we support to make that happen. Hayes nodded slowly. All right, Major. You've got your chance to prove that these tactics can work on a broader scale. But I want you to remember that tactical innovation and cowboy behavior are two different things. Make sure you know the difference. As Sarah walked back to her squadron, she reflected on the challenge ahead. She had 30 days to prove that her split-second tactical decisions could be transformed into standardized procedures that other pilots could use safely and effectively. It was a daunting task, but it was also an opportunity to revolutionize how the Air Force approached close air support. The real work was just beginning. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in every direction as Sarah's A-10 thundered across the Nellis Air Force Base Range complex at 300 feet above ground level. 3 weeks had passed since the engagement in Afghanistan, and those weeks had been a whirlwind of analysis, planning, and preparation for what the Air Force was calling the low-altitude, close air support tactical evaluation. The bureaucratic name didn't capture the significance of what they were attempting. The first formal assessment of A-10 low-altitude tactics in over 2 decades. Major Tom Viper Castellanos flew 2,000 feet to Sarah's left, his A-10 maintaining perfect formation as they approached the target area. Castellanos was a graduate of the Air Force Weapons School and one of the most experienced A-10 pilots in the service. His participation in the evaluation lent credibility to the program and signaled that senior leadership was taking Sarah's tactical proposal seriously. Phoenix Viper Castellanos called over the radio. Target area is 2 miles ahead. I have visual on the SEAL team's position marked with orange panels. Sarah checked her navigation display and confirmed their approach vector. Below them, the realistic training range had been configured to replicate the terrain conditions of the Afghanistan engagement. Rocky outcroppings provided cover for both friendly and enemy positions, while pop-up targets simulated Taliban fighters in various tactical scenarios. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice crackled over the radio from his position on the ground. Phoenix Razor. We have simulated enemy contact at grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 15 targets dispersed among rocky terrain. Friendlies are marked with orange panels 200 meters southwest of target area. This was their 5th training iteration of the day, and each scenario had been designed to test different aspects of low-altitude, close air support tactics. The previous runs had evaluated everything from target identification procedures to coordination protocols between aircraft and ground forces. So far, the results have been promising, but this scenario would test the most challenging aspect of the new tactics: multiple aircraft coordination at low altitude. Sarah banked her aircraft into a steep left turn, scanning the terrain below for both friendly markers and target indicators. From 300 feet, the details were crystal clear. She could see Morrison's team positioned behind a low ridge, their orange identification panels clearly visible against the desert camouflage. Approximately 200 meters to the northeast, red pop-up targets marked enemy positions among a cluster of boulders. Viper Phoenix. I have visual on all friendly and enemy positions. Recommend I take the eastern target cluster while you engage western positions. We'll coordinate gun runs to avoid crossing flight paths. Phoenix Viper. Concur. I'll take first pass on western targets. You follow with eastern engagement. Razor. Confirm you're comfortable with our approach vectors. Morrison's response was immediate and confident. Phoenix Viper. Razor copies all. You are cleared hot on designated targets. We have good separation from all target areas. The difference in Morrison's voice was striking compared to 3 weeks earlier, where once there had been skepticism and concern about low-altitude operations. Now there was confidence and trust. The change hadn't happened overnight. It had been earned through dozens of training iterations and careful demonstration of the tactic's precision and safety. Sarah rolled into her attack run, descending to 250 feet as she lined up on the eastern target cluster. The GU-8's targeting reticle centered on the first group of pop-up targets, and she squeezed the trigger for a controlled 2-second burst. The familiar sound of the cannon echoed across the desert as 30mm practice rounds shredded the target array with surgical precision. "Good hits, Phoenix," called Captain Rodriguez, who was serving as the ground-based observer for this iteration. All eastern targets destroyed, no damage to adjacent terrain features. Castellanos followed with his own gun run, approaching the western targets from a slightly different angle to demonstrate the tactical flexibility of the low-altitude approach. His burst was equally precise, eliminating the remaining targets while avoiding the mock-friendly positions. The post-exercise debrief took place in the range control facility, a climate-controlled building overlooking the vast training complex. The walls were covered with tactical charts and targeting imagery, while multiple flat-screen monitors displayed real-time footage from the training runs. Colonel Webb had flown in from Bagram specifically to observe the evaluation, and his presence added weight to the proceedings. Sarah stood at the front of the room, using a laser pointer to walk through the tactical analysis of the day's training. Charts and graphs displayed engagement times, ammunition expenditure, target destruction rates, and coordination timelines. The data painted a clear picture. Low-altitude tactics consistently outperformed conventional high-altitude approaches in precision, response time, and ammunition efficiency. The results across 15 training scenarios show a 40% improvement in target engagement time and a 60% reduction in ammunition expenditure compared to baseline high-altitude tactics, Sarah explained. More importantly, we achieved 100% target destruction with 0 simulated friendly fire incidents. Colonel Webb studied the data carefully. As a senior officer, he understood that tactical innovation had to be backed by rigorous analysis and measurable results. The preliminary data was impressive, but he needed to understand the broader implications before recommending changes to established doctrine. Major Mitchell, these results are encouraging, but I want to understand the training and experience requirements for pilots to safely employ these tactics. Not every A-10 pilot has your level of experience. It was a crucial question that went to the heart of tactical implementation. Sarah had anticipated this concern and spent considerable time developing training standards and qualification requirements for low-altitude operations. "Sir, we've identified several key skill areas that pilots must master before employing low-altitude, close air support tactics. These include advanced aircraft handling at low altitude, precision gunnery techniques, enhanced situational awareness, and detailed coordination procedures with ground forces." She clicked to the next slide, showing a proposed training curriculum. "We recommend a graduated qualification program similar to the current weapons school model. Pilots would complete ground school training on tactical principles, followed by controlled training flights with experienced instructors, and finally, evaluation flights under realistic combat scenarios." Major Castellanos stood up to add his perspective as the weapons school representative. "Sir, from a pilot training standpoint, these tactics require skills that are within the capability of experienced A-10 pilots, but they do demand a higher level of precision and situational awareness than conventional operations. The training program Major Mitchell has outlined addresses those requirements comprehensively." Morrison joined the discussion from his position near the tactical displays. "Colonel, from the ground force perspective, these tactics require enhanced coordination and communication, but the procedures we've developed provide clear frameworks for safe employment. My team has worked with Major Mitchell to develop standard phrases and coordination protocols that ensure both air and ground elements understand tactical situations clearly." Master Chief Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Sir, the key difference between what we're doing now and what happened 3 weeks ago in Afghanistan is the standardization. Major Mitchell's original tactics worked because of her individual skill and experience, but we've now developed procedures that can be taught and replicated by other crews." Colonel Webb walked to the window overlooking the training range. where A-10s were conducting conventional close-air support training. The contrast between the high-altitude orbits of the training aircraft and the low-level tactics they had been evaluating was stark. After several minutes of contemplation, he turned back to the group. I'm convinced that these tactics offer significant tactical advantages, but I'm concerned about the institutional challenges of implementing them across the A-10 community. We're talking about changing fundamental assumptions that have guided close air support for decades. Sarah had been preparing for this moment since the evaluation began. She understood that tactical innovation required more than just proving effectiveness. It required addressing the institutional and cultural barriers that prevented change. Sir, we're not proposing to replace existing tactics entirely. Low-altitude, close-air support would be an additional capability that pilots could employ when tactical conditions justify the approach. Pilots would still be trained in conventional high-altitude tactics, but they would also have the option to use low-altitude procedures when precision and responsiveness are critical. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had been observing the evaluation via video conference from Bagram, spoke up from one of the monitors. The question is whether we can safely train pilots to make those tactical decisions in combat. The difference between appropriate and inappropriate use of low-altitude tactics could be the difference between mission success and disaster. Castellanos addressed this concern directly. Ma'am, that's exactly why we need formal training standards and qualification requirements. The weapons school has been teaching pilots to make complex tactical decisions for decades. This is just another tool in the tactical toolkit, but like any tool, it requires proper training and experience to use effectively. The discussion continued for another hour, covering everything from aircraft maintenance implications to coordination with other military services. Each question revealed new complexities and considerations that would need to be addressed before the tactics could be widely implemented. Finally, Colonel Webb called for a summary assessment. Major Mitchell, based on 3 weeks of intensive evaluation, what's your recommendation for moving forward with these tactics? Sarah had been preparing for this question throughout the evaluation process. Her answer would determine whether months of work would result in tactical innovation or bureaucratic dead end. Sir, I recommend a phased implementation program beginning with formal inclusion of low-altitude, close-air support tactics in the weapons school curriculum. This would allow us to train instructor pilots who could then return to their squadrons and begin training other pilots in these procedures. Simultaneously, we should develop formal tactical publications that codify the procedures we've tested here. She paused to let the implications sink in. The long-term goal would be to have low-altitude, close-air support as a standard tactical option for experienced A-10 pilots, with clear guidelines for when and how to employ these tactics safely and effectively. Morrison stood up and moved to the tactical display showing the day's training results. Sir, from the special operations perspective, I strongly support Major Mitchell's recommendation. These tactics provide capabilities that we simply don't have with conventional close air support. The precision and responsiveness we've demonstrated here could be game-changing for ground operations. Rodriguez added his support with characteristic directness. Sir, my job is to keep special operations teams alive in combat. If these tactics can do that more effectively than what we're doing now, then we need to make them available to pilots and ground forces as quickly as possible. Colonel Webb nodded slowly as he processed the recommendations and supporting arguments. The decision he made in the next few minutes would have implications far beyond the A-10 community. It would signal the Air Force's willingness to challenge established doctrine and embrace tactical innovation. All right, here's what we're going to do, Webb announced. Major Mitchell, you'll prepare a comprehensive report on these tactics for submission to Air Combat Command. I want detailed analysis of training requirements, safety considerations, equipment modifications, and implementation timelines. Commander Morrison, I want a parallel report from the special operations perspective addressing coordination requirements and operational benefits. He turned to address the group as a whole. I'm recommending that these tactics be approved for limited implementation through the weapons school program. If the broader evaluation supports our preliminary findings, we'll move to full-scale implementation across the A-10 community. Sarah felt a surge of excitement and apprehension. After weeks of intensive work, the evaluation had produced the results she had hoped for, but the real challenge was just beginning. Converting successful training scenarios into operational doctrine would require navigating institutional resistance, regulatory requirements, and the inherent conservatism of military aviation. As the meeting concluded and participants began filing out of the facility, Morrison approached Sarah with an extended hand. "Major, 3 weeks ago, I thought you were a hotshot pilot who was going to get people killed. Now I think you might have revolutionized how we do close air support. It's been an honor working with you on this." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Commander, this never would have worked without your willingness to challenge your own assumptions and help develop these procedures. The real test will be whether we can get other pilots and ground forces to embrace these tactics." Castellanos joined the conversation, his expression serious. "Sarah, you've done something remarkable here, but remember that institutional change takes time. There will be pilots who resist these tactics because they challenge everything they've been taught about safe flying. You'll need patience and persistence to make this work on a broader scale." As Sarah walked across the tarmac toward her aircraft, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a relatively unknown A-10 pilot whose split-second tactical decision had saved 8 Navy SEALs. Now she was on the verge of changing fundamental assumptions about how the Air Force conducted close air support operations. The flight back to Nellis gave her time to think about the challenges ahead. Converting training success into operational doctrine would require convincing skeptical pilots, overcoming institutional resistance, and proving that the tactics could work consistently across different combat scenarios. But for the first time since the engagement in Afghanistan, Sarah felt confident that she was on the right path. The real revolution was just beginning. 6 months after the Nevada evaluation, Sarah found herself standing in the auditorium at the Air Force Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base, facing an audience of 48 A-10 pilots from across the Air Force. The assembled pilots represented the cream of the A-10 community, experienced combat veterans, weapons school graduates, and senior officers who would be responsible for implementing the new low-altitude, close air support tactics throughout their squadrons. The resistance had been immediate and fierce. Major Mitchell called out Major Rick Sledge Hoffman from the third row, his arms crossed, and his expression skeptical. "I've been flying the Hog for 12 years, and I've never needed to fly below 8,000 feet to provide effective close air support. Why should we change tactics that have kept pilots alive and missions successful for 30 years? Hoffman's question captured the sentiment of nearly half the pilots in the room. The A-10 community prided itself on tactical conservatism and methodical approach to operations. Pilots who had survived multiple combat tours using established procedures were naturally suspicious of tactical innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft employment. Sarah had been expecting this reaction since the moment Colonel Webb approved the tactics for formal evaluation and training. Institutional change in military aviation was never easy, and it was particularly difficult when the changes challenged safety-oriented procedures that had been developed through decades of combat experience. "Major Hoffman, that's exactly the right question to ask," Sarah replied, clicking to her first briefing slide. "The tactics I'm presenting today aren't designed to replace existing procedures that work well. They're designed to provide additional options when conventional approaches aren't optimal for the tactical situation." She pulled up aerial footage from the Afghanistan engagement, showing the terrain and target positions that had led to her original tactical decision. In this case, high-altitude tactics would have required using missiles or bombs in close proximity to friendly forces. The low-altitude gun runs provided surgical precision that eliminated the enemy threat while ensuring friendly force safety. Captain Lisa Venom Chun, a weapons school instructor with 8 years of A-10 experience, raised her hand. "Major Mitchell, I understand the tactical advantages you're describing, but I'm concerned about pilot safety. The A-10 is tough, but it's not invulnerable. Flying at 300 feet over defended positions is inherently more dangerous than operating from altitude." The safety concern was legitimate and represented the core of institutional resistance to the new tactics. Military aviation had evolved toward greater use of standoff weapons and high-altitude operations, partly to reduce aircraft losses and pilot casualties. What Sarah was proposing seemed to run counter to that evolution. Captain Shun, you're absolutely right that low-altitude operations involve greater risk to aircraft and aircrew, Sarah acknowledged. But we need to balance that risk against the tactical advantages and the specific mission requirements. The A-10 was designed for close-in ground support, and its armor protection and redundant systems allow it to operate effectively in high-threat environments. She clicked to the next slide, showing detailed analysis of aircraft vulnerability at different altitudes. Our analysis shows that the threat window for low-altitude operations is actually quite narrow. Most shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles are less effective against low, fast-moving targets, and small arms fire, while more likely to hit the aircraft, is unlikely to cause mission-ending damage to properly armored systems. Major Castellanos, who had been observing the discussion, stood up to add his perspective as a weapons school instructor. I want to address the safety concerns directly because they're the heart of this issue. I was initially skeptical of these tactics for exactly the same reasons many of you are expressing. But after participating in the Nevada evaluation, I'm convinced that these procedures can be employed safely by properly trained pilots. He moved to the front of the room and pointed to the tactical analysis displayed on the screen. The key is understanding when and how to use these tactics. This isn't about flying low for the sake of flying low. It's about having additional tools available when the tactical situation requires precision and responsiveness that conventional approaches can't provide. The discussion continued for another hour, with pilots raising concerns about everything from coordination procedures to maintenance implications. Each question revealed the complexity of implementing tactical changes across a large organization with established procedures and institutional culture. Lieutenant Colonel David Hammer Morrison, no relation to the Navy SEAL commander, spoke from the back of the room. As the deputy commander of an A-10 squadron that had recently deployed to Afghanistan, his perspective carried significant weight with the other pilots. Major Mitchell, I've read the reports from your engagement and the Nevada evaluation. The results are impressive from a tactical standpoint, but I'm concerned about implementation across the broader A-10 community. Not every pilot has your level of experience, and not every combat situation will provide the clear tactical picture that allowed your tactics to work. It was a sophisticated objection that went beyond simple resistance to change. Morrison was highlighting the gap between demonstration of tactical effectiveness under controlled conditions and reliable implementation under the stress and uncertainty of actual combat operations. Sarah had anticipated this concern and spent considerable time developing training standards and decision-making frameworks that would help pilots determine when low-altitude tactics were appropriate. Sir, that's exactly why we've developed formal training standards and tactical decision trees. Pilots won't be making split-second decisions about altitude and approach vectors without proper preparation and clear guidelines. She pulled up a complex flowchart showing the decision-making process for employing low-altitude tactics. This tactical decision tree walks pilots through the key factors that should influence their choice of tactics: enemy threat levels, friendly force positions, terrain considerations, weather conditions, and coordination requirements. Pilots who complete the training program will have clear frameworks for making these decisions safely and effectively. Master Chief Rodriguez, who had traveled to Nellis specifically to support the training program, spoke from his position near the instructor station. Gentlemen, ladies, I want to give you the perspective from the ground. I've been working with close air support for 22 years, and I've seen a lot of different approaches to providing fire support for ground operations. The room fell silent as the senior enlisted special operations veteran continued. What Major Mitchell demonstrated in Afghanistan and refined during the Nevada evaluation isn't just incrementally better than conventional tactics. It's qualitatively different. The precision and responsiveness of low-altitude gun runs provided capabilities that we simply don't have with high-altitude operations. He paused to let his words sink in. I understand your concerns about safety and risk because those are my concerns too. But from the ground perspective, the bigger risk is not having the most effective tools available when our people are in contact with the enemy. The tension in the room was palpable as pilots grappled with competing concerns about safety, effectiveness, and institutional change. These were experienced combat veterans who had seen the consequences of tactical mistakes, and their skepticism was based on hard-earned wisdom about the realities of combat aviation. Captain Sarah "Ghost" Williams, a pilot with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for tactical innovation, spoke up from the middle of the room. "Major Mitchell, I want to understand the training progression. How do you propose we take pilots from conventional high-altitude operations to safely employing these low-altitude tactics?" Sarah welcomed the question because it shifted the discussion from whether the tactics should be implemented to how they could be implemented safely and effectively. "Captain Williams, we've developed a graduated training program that builds pilot proficiency incrementally. The program starts with academic instruction on tactical principles and threat analysis, moves to controlled training flights in permissive environments, and culminates with evaluation flights under realistic combat scenarios." She clicked through a series of slides showing the detailed training curriculum. Phase 1 focuses on aircraft handling and gunnery precision at low altitude. Pilots practice gun runs against fixed targets while maintaining precise altitude and airspeed control. Phase 2 introduces dynamic targets and basic coordination procedures. Phase 3 adds realistic threat environments and complex coordination scenarios. Major Castellanos stepped forward to explain the evaluation criteria. Each phase has specific performance standards that pilots must meet before advancing to the next level. The final evaluation requires demonstrating safe and effective employment of low-altitude tactics under simulated combat conditions with live special operations teams providing feedback on coordination and effectiveness. The discussion gradually shifted from wholesale skepticism to detailed questions about implementation. Pilots wanted to understand specific procedures, training timelines, squadron-level requirements, and integration with existing tactical training programs. The questions revealed growing acceptance of the basic concept, even among pilots who remained concerned about practical implementation challenges. Colonel Webb entered the auditorium during a break in the formal briefing, having flown in from his headquarters to gauge the reception of the new tactics among the instructor pilots. His presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room, as pilots recognized that senior leadership was serious about implementing these changes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb announced, "I want to address the concerns I've been hearing about these tactics. Your skepticism is healthy and appropriate. We should never change established procedures without careful consideration of all implications. But I also want you to understand that this initiative has the full support of Air Combat Command and senior Air Force leadership." He moved to the front of the room and faced the assembled pilots directly. "The tactical environment is changing, and we need to ensure that our capabilities evolve to meet new challenges. The low-altitude, close-air support tactics that Major Mitchell has developed provide capabilities that our ground forces need and deserve. Our job is to implement these tactics safely and effectively across the A-10 community." The colonel's statement clarified that implementation was no longer a question of if, but rather how and when. Pilots who had been hoping to derail the initiative through technical objections now understood that their energy would be better spent ensuring proper implementation rather than resisting change. Over the following 2 hours, the discussion became increasingly constructive as pilots engaged with the technical details of the new tactics. Questions focused on coordination procedures, training requirements, equipment modifications, and integration with existing squadron operations. The shift from resistance to problem-solving marked a crucial turning point in the implementation process. As the formal briefing concluded, small groups of pilots gathered around Sarah to continue discussions about specific aspects of the tactics. The questions ranged from technical details about gunnery procedures to broader concerns about how the tactics would affect squadron training programs and deployment preparations. Captain Chin approached Sarah as the room began to clear. "Major Mitchell, I want to apologize for my initial skepticism. After hearing the detailed briefing and seeing the training standards you've developed, I'm convinced that these tactics can be implemented safely. I'd like to volunteer to be one of the first instructor pilots trained in these procedures." Similar conversations were taking place throughout the room as pilots who had entered the briefing with serious reservations began to see the potential value of the new tactics. The shift wasn't universal. Several pilots remained skeptical and would require additional convincing, but the overall momentum had clearly changed in favor of implementation. Major Hoffman, who had voiced some of the strongest initial objections, approached Sarah as she was packing up her briefing materials. "Major, I still have concerns about these tactics, but I can see that they're going to be implemented whether I like it or not. If that's the case, I want to make sure they're done right. I'd like to be involved in the training program development." Sarah smiled and shook his hand. "Major Hoffman, that's exactly the kind of participation we need. Your experience and your concerns will help us develop training standards that address real-world implementation challenges. The best way to ensure these tactics are employed safely is to have experienced pilots involved in every aspect of the program." As Sarah left the auditorium and walked across the flight line toward her quarters, she reflected on the day's events. The briefing had been challenging, but it had also demonstrated that even skeptical pilots could be convinced to embrace tactical innovation when it was presented with proper analysis, training standards, and institutional support. The real test would come in the following months as the first group of instructor pilots completed training and began implementing the tactics in their home squadrons. Success would depend on their ability to train other pilots effectively and demonstrate the value of the new procedures under operational conditions. But for the first time since beginning this journey, Sarah felt confident that the institutional resistance could be overcome and that low-altitude, close air support would become a standard capability across the A-10 community. The revolution was becoming doctrine. 2 years after that first engagement in Afghanistan, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood on the observation deck of the Pentagon, watching aircraft trace contrails across the Virginia sky. The promotion had come 6 months earlier, along with a new assignment as the Air Force's liaison to the Joint Special Operations Command. The position was both recognition of her tactical innovations and an opportunity to expand low-altitude, close air support tactics across all military services. The numbers told the story of institutional transformation. Over the past 18 months, 47 A-10 pilots had completed the low-altitude, close air support training program. These pilots had subsequently trained an additional 180 pilots in their home squadrons, creating a cadre of qualified instructors across the A-10 community. More importantly, the tactics have been employed successfully in 43 combat missions with 0 friendly fire incidents and a 95% mission success rate. Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Colonel Webb, now serving as the Director of Operations for Air Combat Command. The message was brief but significant. Low-altitude SAS approved for inclusion in official Air Force doctrine. Publication expected within 90 days. Congratulations on changing how we fight. The formal doctrinal approval represented the culmination of 2 years of testing, training, and institutional navigation. What had begun as a split-second tactical decision during a firefight in Afghanistan was now officially recognized as a standard Air Force capability. But Sarah knew that the real measure of success wasn't bureaucratic approval. It was the lives saved and missions accomplished by pilots using the tactics in combat. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock on her office door. Master Chief Rodriguez entered, wearing the crisp dress blues of his new assignment as the senior enlisted advisor for Special Operations Aviation Training. His weathered face showed the same direct expression that had characterized their first meeting 2 years earlier, but now it was tempered with respect and genuine friendship. "Colonel Mitchell," Rodriguez said with a slight smile, "I thought you'd want to know that Commander Morrison's team just completed another successful mission using your tactics. This time it was in Syria, supporting a hostage rescue operation." Sarah gestured for Rodriguez to sit down, eager to hear details of the latest employment of the low-altitude tactics. Each combat use provided valuable feedback that helped refine training procedures and operational guidelines. "The situation was similar to what we faced in Afghanistan," Rodriguez continued. Morrison's team was pinned down by enemy fighters in an urban environment. Conventional close air support wasn't feasible because of civilian structures and the proximity of friendly forces. Captain Chun, you remember her from the weapons school briefing, made 3 low-altitude gun runs that eliminated 12 enemy fighters and allowed the team to complete the rescue mission. Sarah felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from knowing her tactical innovations were making a difference in real-world operations. But she also felt the weight of responsibility that accompanied that success. Every pilot who employed these tactics was putting their aircraft and their life at greater risk, trusting in training procedures and tactical principles that she had developed. How did Captain Chen handle the coordination challenges? Sarah asked. Urban operations presented unique difficulties for low-altitude, close air support, including civilian considerations, complex terrain, and restricted maneuver space. Rodriguez pulled out a tablet showing gun camera footage from the Syria mission. She followed the procedures exactly as trained. Multiple confirmation of target identification, continuous coordination with ground forces, and precise fire control that eliminated enemy threats while avoiding any civilian casualties or structural damage. The footage showed Chen's A-10 maneuvering through urban terrain at altitudes that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Her gun runs were textbook examples of the precision and control that the training program was designed to develop. The 30mm rounds impacted exactly on target, eliminating enemy positions while leaving adjacent buildings untouched. The rescue team extracted all 5 hostages without injury, Rodriguez added. Mission Commander specifically cited the precision close air support as a critical factor in mission success. As they watched the footage, Sarah reflected on how far the tactics had evolved since that first engagement. The basic principles remained the same. Use the A-10's capabilities to provide precise, responsive fire support from low altitude. But the procedures have been refined through dozens of training iterations and combat applications. The urban environment missions had been particularly challenging to develop. Cities presented unique hazards including power lines, tall buildings, civilian populations, and complex three-dimensional terrain that affected both aircraft maneuverability and weapons employment. The training program had evolved to include specialized urban operations modules that prepared pilots for these challenging environments. A secure video call notification appeared on Sarah's computer, showing an incoming call from Afghanistan. She recognized the caller ID as belonging to Major Williams, the pilot who had volunteered to be one of the first instructors trained in the low-altitude tactics. Williams now commanded an A-10 squadron deployed to Bagram Airfield, where she was implementing the tactics on a large scale for the first time. Sarah accepted the call, and Williams' face appeared on the screen against the backdrop of the familiar Bagram Operations Center. The squadron commander looked tired, but energetic, the expression of someone dealing with the challenges and satisfaction of combat operations. Colonel Mitchell, Williams began, I wanted to give you a personal update on how the tactics are performing in theater. We've now completed 26 low-altitude, close-air support missions over the past 4 months, supporting everything from special operations raids to conventional ground force operations. Sarah leaned forward, interested in Williams' assessment as both a trained instructor and an operational squadron commander. Major Williams, what's your evaluation of pilot proficiency and mission effectiveness? Williams consulted notes on her desk before responding. Pilot performance has been excellent across the board. The training program you developed prepared our crews well for the tactical challenges they've faced. We've seen consistent improvement in target engagement times, ammunition efficiency, and coordination with ground forces. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The psychological impact on enemy forces has also been significant. Taliban fighters have learned to fear the sound of low-altitude 10-gun runs. We're seeing behavioral changes in how they position themselves and respond to air threats. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's exactly what we saw during the development phase. The psychological effect of close-in precision fires can be as important as the physical damage. Williams continued with her operational assessment. From a squadron perspective, the tactics have required some adjustments to our training and maintenance procedures. Low-altitude operations put different stresses on aircraft systems, and we've had to modify our inspection intervals for certain components. But overall, the operational benefits far outweigh the additional maintenance requirements. Sarah was pleased to hear that the practical implementation challenges had been manageable. One of her greatest concerns during the development phase had been whether squadron-level operations could effectively support the tactics without excessive strain on aircraft or personnel. Major Williams, what feedback are you getting from the ground forces you've supported? Sarah asked. Ground force acceptance was crucial for the long-term success of any close air support innovation. Williams smiled for the first time during the call. Colonel, the ground forces love these tactics. Word has spread throughout the special operations community that A-10s can provide precision fires that other aircraft simply can't match. We're getting specific requests for low-altitude support from units that have worked with us before. She pulled up a statistics display on her computer. Our mission effectiveness ratings from supported ground forces are running 20% higher than the theater average for close air support missions. Ground commanders are specifically citing the precision and responsiveness of low-altitude gun runs as factors in mission success. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from tactical refinements to training program improvements. Williams provided detailed feedback on specific missions, including challenges that had led to modifications in standard procedures. Each piece of information would be incorporated into ongoing program development and training updates. As the call concluded, Sarah reflected on the institutional journey that had brought the tactics from experimental innovation to standard operational capability. The transformation hadn't been smooth or simple. It had required navigating resistance from pilots, convincing skeptical commanders, developing comprehensive training standards, and proving effectiveness through rigorous testing and evaluation. Rodriguez, who had remained quiet during most of the call, spoke up as Sarah closed the video connection. Colonel, I want you to know that what you accomplished goes beyond just developing new tactics. You changed how the military thinks about innovation and institutional adaptation. Sarah looked at him curiously, unsure what he meant by the broader implications of her work. When you made that first gun run in Afghanistan, you weren't just making a tactical decision, Rodriguez explained. You were challenging decades of established doctrine and institutional assumptions. The fact that the military was able to recognize the value of your innovation and implement it successfully shows that we can still adapt and evolve. He paused, his expression serious. In special operations, we see a lot of officers who are good at following established procedures, and we see some who are good at improvising under pressure. But it's rare to find someone who can do both, who can innovate in the moment and then transform that innovation into institutional capability. Sarah felt the weight of his words and the responsibility they implied. Military innovation wasn't just about having good ideas. It was about having the persistence and institutional knowledge to transform those ideas into practical capabilities that could be employed safely and effectively by other people. A soft chime from her computer indicated another incoming message, this time from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The subject line read, Inter-Service Implementation of Low-Altitude Close Air Support Tactics. Sarah opened the message and quickly scanned its contents, feeling excitement build as she read. The message indicated that the Navy and Marine Corps were requesting formal training programs to implement modified versions of the A-10's low-altitude tactics for their own close air support aircraft. The Marines were particularly interested in adapting the procedures for their AV-8B Harrier operations, while the Navy wanted to explore applications for their F/A-18 aircraft. Rodriguez, look at this, Sarah said, turning her computer screen so he could read the message. They want to expand the tactics to other services and aircraft types. Rodriguez read the message carefully, his expression showing both excitement and concern. That's incredible recognition of what you've accomplished, but it's also going to present some significant challenges. Each aircraft type will have different capabilities and limitations that affect how the tactics can be employed. Sarah nodded, already thinking through the implications. The A-10's unique characteristics, heavy armor protection, powerful cannon, excellent low-speed handling, have been crucial factors in developing the original tactics. Adapting the procedures for faster, less armored aircraft would require significant modifications while preserving the fundamental principles that made the tactics effective. Her phone rang, showing a call from the office of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Sarah answered immediately, recognizing that calls from such high levels usually indicated either very good news or very serious problems. "Colonel Mitchell, this is General Harrison's office," the voice said formally. "The general would like to see you in his office at 1,400 hours today to discuss expansion of the low-altitude, close air support program to joint operations." After confirming the appointment, Sarah hung up and turned to Rodriguez. "Well, it looks like we're about to find out how far this revolution can spread." As Rodriguez left her office to return to his duties, Sarah stood again at her window overlooking the Pentagon parking area. 2 years earlier, she had been a relatively unknown major whose split-second tactical decision had led to an unexpected chain of events. Now she was being called to brief the Air Force Chief of Staff on the expansion of those tactics throughout the military. The irony wasn't lost on her. Military institutions were often criticized for their resistance to change and innovation, but her experience had demonstrated that good ideas backed by rigorous analysis and persistent advocacy could still transform established doctrine. The key was understanding that innovation required not just tactical creativity, but also institutional navigation and the patience to build consensus among skeptical colleagues. Her computer chimed again with another message, this time from Lieutenant Commander Morrison. The SEAL officer, now promoted and serving as the Senior Special Operations Liaison to Air Combat Command, had become one of the strongest advocates for expanding low-altitude, close air support capabilities. "Sarah," the message read, "just wanted you to know that your tactics saved 8 more lives yesterday in Somalia. Special operations teams are specifically requesting A-10 support because they know they'll get the precision fires they need when things go wrong. Thank you for changing how we think about close air support." Sarah smiled as she read Morrison's message, remembering their first meeting in the briefing room at Bagram, when he had been skeptical of any departure from established procedures. The transformation in his attitude reflected the broader institutional acceptance that had made widespread implementation possible. As she prepared for the meeting with General Harrison, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned from 2 years of tactical innovation and institutional change. Success had required not just good ideas, but also careful analysis, rigorous testing, comprehensive training development, and persistent advocacy in the face of institutional resistance.